The auction hammer fell with a decisive crack that echoed through the county courthouse. For just $1,200, Eleanor Reed became the proud owner of 5 acres and what remained of the MacAllister cabin. Locals called it cursed, abandoned for decades after the MacAllisters vanished without explanation. Some claimed they fled in the night. Others whispered darker tales. Eleanor didn't believe in curses, just opportunities. At 48, with a divorce behind her and retirement savings that wouldn't stretch far in the city, this remote Montana property represented her fresh start. The realtor's photos hadn't done justice to the cabin's dilapidation: rotted floorboards, collapsed roof sections, and evidence of animals making themselves at home. But it was the massive, unmistakably humanoid footprint, pressed into the dried mud by the creek, that made Eleanor's blood run cold. Eleanor pulled her weathered Ford pickup to a stop at the edge of what could generously be called a driveway. Gravel had long since given way to weeds and saplings. The cabin stood, or rather leaned, in a small clearing ahead, silhouetted against the dimming Montana sky. "Home sweet home," she murmured, reaching into the passenger seat for her grandmother's quilt. The faded pattern of blues and greens had comforted her through childhood storms, her divorce, and now this leap into the unknown. A quick exploration of the cabin's perimeter confirmed what she already knew. No way was she sleeping inside tonight. The west wall had partially collapsed, and what remained of the roof wouldn't keep out a determined squirrel, let alone the rain clouds gathering on the horizon. Eleanor set up her camp stove beside the truck and heated a can of beef stew as daylight faded. The forest around her grew louder as night creatures began their chorus. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders, feeling its familiar weight. 22 years with Richard, gone. Her ranger job surrendered when they moved for his promotion. The city apartment she'd never felt at home in, now someone else's. And here she was, starting over at 48 with nothing but determination and a toolbox. A crack of branches breaking in the forest jerked Eleanor from her thoughts. She reached for her flashlight, sweeping its beam across the tree line. Nothing moved, but the night sounds had gone silent. "Probably deer," she said aloud, her voice sounding thin in the darkness. She climbed into the truck's cab for the night, rolling up the windows despite the warmth. The quilt tucked around her body smelled of home, the only constant in her changing world. Sleep came fitfully. Twice she woke to scratching sounds against the truck's exterior, once to a low, huffing breath that sounded too close, too large to be any woodland creature she recognized from her ranger days. When dawn finally broke, Eleanor stretched her stiff limbs and pushed open the truck door, eager for coffee. She'd taken 3 steps toward her camp stove when she froze. Massive impressions circled her truck, the same enormous footprints she'd seen by the creek yesterday. Only these were fresh, the soil still disturbed. Whatever had made them had been here, walking around her vehicle while she slept. Eleanor knelt beside the closest print, her hand, fingers splayed wide, barely covered half its width. She traced the clear outline of 5 toes, the distinctive arch. "Not a bear," she whispered. The quilt slipped from her shoulders as she stood and slowly turned in place, scanning the forest edge. Nothing moved, but she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Her satellite phone showed no service, not unexpected in these mountains. The nearest neighbor was miles away, the nearest town further still. "This changes nothing," Eleanor told herself firmly, retrieving her quilt from the ground. She folded it precisely, the way her grandmother had taught her, and placed it back in the truck. Today's plan remained the same: assess the cabin, clear debris, determine what could be salvaged. If something was out there, making itself known, she wouldn't give it the satisfaction of seeing her scared off. Eleanor Reed hadn't survived divorce and starting over to be frightened away by footprints, no matter how impossibly large. She'd bought this land fair and square, and whatever was lurking in the woods would just have to adjust to having a new neighbor. She unloaded her toolbox from the truck bed, selecting a crowbar and hammer. The cabin beckoned, its broken frame a challenge she understood. Creatures in the forest were unknowns, but rotted wood and rusty nails, those she could handle. Still, as she approached the cabin, Eleanor found herself looking back over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something in the dense forest was looking right back at her. The 30-mile drive to Pine Ridge took Eleanor along winding mountain roads that snaked between towering pines and sudden, breathtaking vistas. Her truck's suspension protested each pothole, reminding her that vehicle maintenance would soon join her growing list of expenses. Pine Ridge barely qualified as a town, a cluster of buildings around a single intersection, anchored by a general store with faded red siding. Eleanor pulled into the gravel lot and checked her handwritten list of supplies. Inside, the store smelled of coffee, leather, and sawdust. A gray-haired man looked up from behind the counter. "Morning," he nodded, passing through. "Actually, I just moved to the area." Eleanor extended her hand. "Eleanor Reed." The man's weathered face registered surprise. "Jake Wilson, where'd you settle?" "I work the old MacAllister place at the county auction." Jake's handshake froze mid-pump. "The MacAllister cabin, out past Widow's Creek." "That's the one." Jake released her hand, whistling low. "Been empty for years. Nobody goes out that way much anymore." He pulled a hand-drawn map from beneath the counter. "You're way out here." He circled an area with his pencil. "Rough country." Eleanor studied the map, noticing several areas marked with X's and the words "danger zone." "What's this mean?" she asked, pointing. "Just places folks have had incidents. Mountain lions, mostly." He didn't meet her eyes. "Listen, that cabin's been abandoned since '92. MacAllisters left in quite a hurry, so I heard." "Any idea why?" Jake busied himself with a box of nails. "Rumors is all. Some say family troubles. Others say they saw something in those woods they couldn't explain." He lowered his voice. "You staying out there alone?" Eleanor stiffened. "I can handle myself." "No doubt, but even experienced outdoorsmen get in trouble up there sometimes." Jake pulled a shotgun from a rack behind him. "Remington 870. Good reliable protection against whatever you might encounter." Eleanor considered her dwindling savings, then the footprints around her truck. "How much?" 2 hours later, Eleanor slid into a booth at the Pine Ridge Diner, her truck now loaded with supplies and the used shotgun Jake had sold her at a neighbor discount. "Coffee." A waitress with a silver braid approached. "Please. And whatever's hot for lunch." "Beef stew today." The woman studied Eleanor. "New face around here." "Just moved in." "Eleanor Reed." "Mabel Thornton." She poured coffee with practiced precision. "Where you staying?" "The MacAllister place." Mabel's coffee pot tilted dangerously. "Lord above. That's been empty since I was still dyeing my gray. So I keep hearing." "What happened to them?" Mabel glanced around the empty diner, then slid into the booth opposite Eleanor. "The MacAllisters were good people. John worked forestry. Mary taught at the school. 2 kids. Then one day, gone, house left like they walked out mid-dinner. Some say witness protection. Others say they saw things in those woods." "What kinds of things?" "Mary used to come in here, told me about strange noises, missing livestock." Mabel leaned closer. "Once said she saw a creature, tall as a bear, standing up, but walking on 2 legs like a man, covered in hair." Eleanor's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "And you believe that?" "Don't matter what I believe." Mabel stood. "But Jake Wilson's brother was on the search party when they first went missing. He quit the sheriff's department after what they found out there." The stew arrived steaming, but Eleanor's appetite had diminished. She left Pine Ridge with more questions than answers and an unsettled feeling that followed her back up the mountain road. As Eleanor unloaded supplies at the cabin, daylight was already fading. She secured her food in the truck, not from bears, she realized, but from whatever had circled her vehicle last night. The shotgun rested across her knees as she sat on the cabin's broken porch steps, watching darkness claim the forest. "I know you're out there," she said into the gathering shadows, "and I'm not going anywhere." Only the wind answered, whispering through the pines with what almost sounded like words. Eleanor attacked the cabin cleanup with methodical determination. She started by clearing fallen debris from what was once the living room, salvaging anything useful and creating a burn pile for the rest. By midday, sweat soaked her shirt, despite the cool mountain air. As she pried up a section of rotted floorboard, something caught her eye. Deep gouges marked the exposed wooden beam beneath, 4 parallel lines too uniform to be random damage. "Claw marks," she murmured, tracing the grooves with her fingertips. A thorough search revealed more marks throughout the cabin, concentrated around windows and doorways. In a corner where the roof remained partially intact, Eleanor discovered tufts of coarse hair caught in a nail. Not bear fur, too long, and with an unusual reddish-brown color she couldn't place. She sealed a sample in a plastic bag, her ranger training kicking in. Evidence, though, of what? She wasn't certain. The cabin's rear storage area had fared better against the elements. Eleanor managed to clear enough space for her camping supplies, creating a makeshift headquarters more secure than her truck. She rigged tarps over the broken roof sections just as the afternoon rain began. As darkness approached, Eleanor placed battery-powered lanterns around her workspace. Her food supplies, secured in a bear-proof container, stood just inside the cabin's reinforced rear door. A crash outside sent her reaching for the shotgun. She found her container tipped over, the latch somehow worked loose, food items scattered and partially consumed. Bear-proof apparently wasn't proof against everything. "This is getting ridiculous," Eleanor muttered, gathering what remained. The next morning she drove back to Pine Ridge and returned with 3 trail cameras, expensive but necessary. She positioned them strategically, one covering the cabin approach, another monitoring the creek where she'd found the first footprint, and the third overlooking her supply area. Days passed in a rhythm of work and watchfulness. The cabin slowly transformed, debris cleared, structural repairs begun, a new generator providing power. But each morning brought fresh evidence of nighttime visitations, moved tools, disturbed materials, once even a crude arrangement of pine cones that seemed almost deliberate in their pattern. The cameras captured nothing but ordinary wildlife, until the 5th night. Eleanor woke to a crashing sound and the generator sputtering into silence. She grabbed her flashlight and shotgun, cautiously moving toward the noise. The generator had been overturned, fuel spilling onto the ground. One of her trail cameras, the one monitoring supplies, lay shattered nearby, its metal casing bent as if crushed by enormous strength. Heart pounding, Eleanor retreated to the cabin's reinforced back room, barricading the door. With first light, she collected the memory cards from her remaining cameras. The creekside camera showed nothing unusual. The cabin approach camera had captured something at 2:17 a.m., a massive, shadowy figure moving with surprising grace for its size. The image was blurred, but unmistakably bipedal, at least 7 feet tall. The footage ended abruptly as the figure seemed to notice the camera, moving toward it with startling speed before transmission cut. Eleanor played it again, freeze framing at the clearest moment. The figure remained frustratingly indistinct, but she could make out broad shoulders, a sloping head, and what appeared to be shaggy hair covering its body. "Not a bear," she whispered, her earlier suspicions confirmed. She packed the remaining cameras higher in trees, angling them downward and camouflaging them with branches. Something intelligent enough to spot and disable surveillance wouldn't be fooled for long, but she needed more evidence. That evening, Eleanor double-checked her improvised security measures, fishing lines strung with tin cans around the perimeter, cabin doors reinforced with scavenged lumber. Her shotgun rested within reach as she reviewed her options. Leaving meant surrendering everything she'd invested, financially and emotionally. Staying meant facing whatever roamed these woods after dark. "I've never backed down from a challenge," she told the empty cabin, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'm not about to start now." Outside, as twilight deepened into night, something large moved through the underbrush at the forest's edge, watching the warm glow of Eleanor's lanterns, with eyes that reflected the gathering darkness. Dark clouds rolled in over the mountains, bringing with them the rumble of distant thunder. Eleanor worked frantically to secure the tarp covering the cabin's partially repaired roof. Wind whipped the blue plastic, threatening to tear it from her grasp as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. "Just perfect," she muttered, hammering the final securing nail as lightning split the sky. By the time she retreated inside, rain was falling in sheets. Water immediately found its way through the inadequate patches, forming puddles on the newly swept floor. Eleanor dragged her sleeping bag to the only completely dry corner and fired up the generator outside under its protective covering. The storm intensified, wind howling through the trees with an almost human quality that set her nerves on edge. She busied herself making a plaster cast of the clearest footprint she'd found, working by lantern light as thunder boomed overhead. Just after midnight, the generator sputtered and died. Eleanor zipped her jacket and ventured out with a flashlight. Rain pelted her face as she examined the machine. The fuel line had been disconnected, not broken, but deliberately removed. A lightning flash illuminated the clearing, and for a split second, Eleanor saw it, standing at the edge of the forest, massive, upright, watching. The darkness that followed seemed absolute. Eleanor fumbled for the shotgun slung across her back, nearly dropping it with rain-slick hands. "Hello?" she called, immediately regretting giving away her position. Another flash revealed the figure had moved closer, impossibly fast and silent, despite its bulk. Eleanor caught a glimpse of a broad, sloping forehead, deep-set eyes reflecting her flashlight beam, and a body covered in matted dark hair. She fired a warning shot into the air. The blast echoed through the trees, momentarily drowning out even the thunder. When the next lightning flash came, the clearing was empty. Eleanor backed toward the cabin, scanning the darkness, every sense heightened. Inside, she barricaded the door with a shelf and retreated to her corner, shotgun across her knees. Sleep was impossible. Each crack of thunder, each howl of wind, might be something approaching. Dawn arrived with clearing skies. Eleanor, exhausted but alert, ventured outside to survey the damage. Her reconstruction work had been systematically destroyed. Wood planks she'd carefully measured and cut lay splintered. Tools were scattered as if thrown in anger. Most disturbing was the message. Crude letters scratched into the mud near her cast footprint. "Go Eleanor," photographed everything before the strengthening sun dried the evidence. She spent hours restoring order to her worksite, mind racing. The creature she could no longer pretend it was anything else had shown not just intelligence, but the ability to communicate. And it wanted her gone. Using a plastic basin, Eleanor mixed fresh plaster and carefully poured it into the new footprint left at the forest's edge, the clearest one yet. While it set, she searched the area, finding more tufts of the reddish-brown hair caught on low branches. The plaster cast, when dry, was remarkable in its detail. Over 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and an arch like a human foot, only massively scaled up. The impression was so deep that whatever made it must have weighed hundreds of pounds. Eleanor placed the cast on the cabin's porch steps, a tangible reminder that she wasn't imagining things. She worked until sunset repairing what had been destroyed, frequently stopping to scan the tree line. The sensation of being watched never left her. Twice she spotted movement among the pines, too deliberate to be wind, too large to be any normal forest animal. As darkness fell, Eleanor built a fire in the clearing, partly for warmth, partly as a precaution. She'd read that most wild creatures feared fire, but as she sat beside the flames, shotgun close at hand, Eleanor understood that what watched her from the darkness was not most creatures. It could disable generators. It could write warnings. It wanted her land, and it had just made its first direct move in what Eleanor realized was becoming a territorial war. The Pine Ridge County Library occupied the former town hall, a stone building with high windows and creaking wooden floors. Eleanor entered with her notebook and the plastic bag containing hair samples, nodding to the elderly librarian who watched her with undisguised curiosity. Local history section, Eleanor asked. Back corner. The woman adjusted her glasses, looking for anything in particular. Information about this area, especially unusual sightings or local legends. Something flickered across the librarian's face. Folklore's on the bottom shelf. Newspaper archives are in the filing cabinets. Eleanor spent hours poring through dusty volumes and yellowed newspapers. What began as a casual investigation soon became an obsessive documentation of patterns. Dating back to the 1800s, accounts described a wild man of the mountains or forest devil roaming the precise region where her cabin stood. An 1879 trapper's journal recounted finding his cabin ransacked, with great footprints unlike any human or beast circling the structure. A 1924 newspaper reported 3 lumberjacks abandoning their camp after being terrorized by an enormous, hair-covered creature walking upright like a man. The most valuable find was a book titled Cryptids of the Northern Rockies. Its margins were filled with handwritten notes, locations and dates, including several near Eleanor's property. On the inside cover, a name: William Cooper, Forest Service, 1982-2012. Eleanor photographed the most relevant pages with her phone before approaching the librarian. "Do you know William Cooper?" The woman's eyebrows rose. "Bill? Sure. Retired from the Forest Service years ago. Lives out on Cedar Ridge Road. I'd like to speak with him. It's about the MacAllister property." The librarian's expression shifted. "You're the one who bought that place." It wasn't a question. Bill's usually at the diner for lunch. Wears a green Forest Service jacket. Can't miss him. Eleanor found Cooper exactly as described, gray-haired, weathered, nursing a coffee at the corner booth of Pine Ridge Diner. He looked up when she approached. "Bill Cooper, I'm Eleanor Reed." The librarian said, "You might be able to help me. Depends what you need help with." His voice was gruff, but not unfriendly. "I bought the old MacAllister place. I found your notes in a book about local cryptids." Cooper's cup froze halfway to his lips. "Sit down." He glanced around before continuing, voice lowered. "What have you seen out there?" Eleanor described the footprints, the destroyed camera, the warning message, and finally, the storm night encounter. Cooper listened without interruption, his expression grim but unsurprised. "Sasquatch," he said, when she finished. "Bigfoot. Whatever name you prefer. Been out there longer than any of us. You've seen it? October 1994. Tracking reports of illegal hunting. Found myself being tracked instead." Cooper rolled up his sleeve, revealing 3 parallel scars running from elbow to wrist. "Got too close to something I shouldn't have. Never reported it officially. Career suicide. The MacAllisters. John MacAllister contacted me privately after several encounters. Family was terrified, but didn't want authorities involved. Said the creatures seemed interested in their children, watching them, leaving gifts of killed rabbits or unusual stones." "Creatures? Plural?" Cooper nodded. John spotted at least 3 different individuals over time. A large male, a smaller one possibly female, and what he thought was a juvenile. "What happened to the family?" "Official story: abandoned the property, moved away." Cooper's eyes held Eleanor's. "Unofficial: John called me in a panic one night. Said government men had been asking questions in town. Next day, place was empty. No forwarding address. You think they were running from the creatures? I think they were running with them." Cooper drained his coffee. "Some said they were protecting whatever lived in those woods from people who wanted to capture or kill it." Eleanor felt a chill. "And you believe that?" "I believe there are things in these mountains older and smarter than most give credit for. And I believe the MacAllisters knew something that made them abandon everything they owned in a single night." Cooper scribbled his phone number on a napkin. "You see anything else out there, you call me. And a word of advice: those creatures are territorial, but not necessarily malicious, unless they feel threatened." Eleanor returned to her cabin as sunset painted the mountains gold. She pinned her research notes and photos to the newly repaired wall, creating a timeline of sightings and encounters. The pattern was undeniable. She wasn't the first to face this situation, merely the latest in a long history. The question remained, should she follow the warning scratched in the mud, or the example of the MacAllisters, whose connection to the creatures apparently ran deeper than fear? Eleanor spread the hand-drawn security diagram across a makeshift table, weighing its corners with stones. Her ranger training had included wilderness survival and perimeter security for remote outposts, skills she'd never imagined using against an intelligent, non-human threat. "Know your terrain, know your adversary," she muttered, recalling her instructor's words. The creature had advantages: strength, size, knowledge of the surroundings, and night vision far superior to her own. Eleanor's advantages were fewer, but significant: human tools, strategic thinking, and the cabin as a defendable position. She began systematically implementing her plan. First, clearing a 10-foot perimeter around the cabin for visibility. Then, establishing early warning systems, fishing lines strung between trees at varying heights, each rigged with aluminum cans containing pebbles, low-tech but effective. The setup would alert her to anything approaching from any direction. Eleanor positioned battery-powered motion sensor lights at key points facing outward, their sudden brightness designed to startle and temporarily blind nocturnal visitors. She installed hasps and padlocks on all doors and shutters for the windows she'd repaired. Not to keep something out, she reminded herself, but to make entry noisy and slow. In her ranger days, Eleanor had been taught to establish multiple escape routes for any base camp. She cleared paths leading in 3 different directions from the cabin, each carefully camouflaged from casual observation, but obvious to her. One led to a defensible rock outcropping, another to a hollow fallen tree large enough to hide in temporarily, the third to her truck, always parked ready to leave, keys hidden in a magnetic box underneath. Inside the cabin, Eleanor created zones. The reinforced back room became her secure sleeping area. The main room, now with a repaired roof and floor, served as her command center. Maps, notes, and her security plan diagram covered one wall. A workbench with tools lined another. She kept the shotgun loaded and positioned near every door and window. "Last resort," she whispered, running her fingers along the weapon's barrel. Despite her determination, Eleanor had no desire to harm the creature. Something that could write a warning was too intelligent to be treated as a mere animal. As she swept the repaired floor one evening, Eleanor noticed an unusual draft from beneath a section of floorboards. Investigation revealed a loose board concealing a narrow space below. Further probing uncovered a trapdoor, its existence hidden by years of accumulated debris. Using her flashlight, Eleanor peered into darkness. A steep ladder descended into what appeared to be a storm cellar, a concrete-lined room approximately 8 feet square, perfect as a last resort shelter or storage space. She cleared the entrance and climbed down cautiously, sweeping her light across the space. Empty shelves lined one wall. A small ventilation pipe provided air from outside. Most surprisingly, the cellar appeared untouched by the creatures that had clearly explored every other part of the cabin. Perhaps they don't like going underground, Eleanor mused, already planning how to stock this unexpected sanctuary. By week's end, the property's transformation was remarkable. From outside, the cabin still appeared dilapidated, a deliberate deception. Inside, it had become a surprisingly comfortable, strategically secure outpost. The storm cellar now contained emergency supplies, including food, water, medical kit, flashlights, and Eleanor's most irreplaceable possession, her grandmother's quilt. That night she sat on the porch steps, with a cup of tea, surveying her work with quiet satisfaction. The security measures weren't meant to last forever, just long enough for her to better understand what she was dealing with. Movement at the tree line caught her attention, a shadow darker than the surrounding darkness. observing her as intently as she had been observing the forest. Eleanor raised her cup in a mock toast. "I'm staying," she called out, her voice steady. "We might as well figure out how to coexist." The shadow remained motionless for several seconds, then melted back into the forest with an almost imperceptible sound that might have been a grunt or a whir. Eleanor descended the narrow ladder into the storm cellar with a lantern and cleaning supplies. Now that her security measures were in place, she could properly explore this underground room, potentially her most secure refuge, if things escalated with the forest visitor. The air was musty, but not foul, suggesting the ventilation system still functioned. Eleanor swept cobwebs from corners and wiped years of dust from the shelves. Behind a stack of empty mason jars, her cloth caught on something. A metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, had been concealed behind the jars. Eleanor carried it to the center of the room and carefully opened the rusted latch. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal with MacAllister family embossed on the cover. Beside it lay a yellowed envelope containing photographs, a child's drawing, and a small brass key. Eleanor climbed back upstairs, box in hand, and settled at her table. The journal's first entry was dated April 12, 1990. Moved in today. Mary loves the mountain view. Tommy and Sarah spent hours exploring the creek. I start work with Forest Service next week. This place feels right, like we were meant to find it. The early entries described ordinary family life, gardening challenges, home repairs, wildlife sightings. 6 months in, the tone shifted. October 24, found strange tracks behind the woodshed again. Too large for bear, shape all wrong. Mary thinks I'm working too hard. November 8, something took the deer I'd hung to cure, dragged it off, left unusual tracks. Not wolves or mountain lions. December 16, caught glimpse of something watching the house tonight. Tall, upright. Thought it was a man until it moved. Too big, too fast. By spring, the encounters had escalated. April 3, 1991, found offerings on the porch. Dead rabbit, arranged stones. Sarah said the forest people left them. Thought she was making up stories. May 15, Tommy spotted one clearly today, over 7 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair, walking upright. Watched him fishing but made no aggressive moves. Tommy wasn't afraid, said it felt curious. Eleanor paused, examining the photographs. Most showed the family or cabin, but one blurry image captured a dark shape among distant trees, indistinct but unmistakably large and bipedal. The child's drawing showed a family of 4, standing beside crude representations of 3 larger, hair-covered figures. Our neighbors was scrawled in a child's handwriting across the bottom. Eleanor returned to the journal, which grew increasingly concerned over time. August 30. Sarah leaves food at the forest edge. Says the forest people are hungry. They take everything, leave unusual stones or carved sticks in return. September 16. Mary saw them clearly when she was hanging laundry. A male, female and juvenile, she thinks, standing at the tree line, watching. She wasn't frightened, said they seemed intelligent, cautious. The final entries revealed a dramatic shift. January 8, 1992. Men in town asking questions, said they were wildlife researchers, asked specifically about unusual sightings, large footprints, don't trust them. January 12, same men parked on the access road today, using binoculars to watch our property, caught one placing something in the trees, looked like a camera. January 20, called Bill Cooper. He confirmed my suspicions. Government team has been tracking reports of non-human bipedal entities for years. Captures them for study. Most never seen again. The last entry was hurriedly scrawled, the handwriting barely legible. February 12, they're coming tomorrow. Team of researchers with tranquilizer guns and transport vehicles. We warned our forest friends. They understand the danger. We've made our decision. When this is found, we'll be long gone. May whoever reads this show the same compassion we did. These beings aren't monsters, they're a family like us. They were here first. Eleanor closed the journal, hands trembling slightly. The story wasn't what she'd expected. The MacAllisters hadn't fled in fear from the creatures they'd apparently left to protect them, possibly even helping them escape. The brass key remained a mystery. Eleanor examined it carefully. Old-fashioned, possibly for a padlock or small cabinet. She pocketed it, certain it would prove important. As she returned the journal to the metal box, a slip of paper fell from between the final pages. Coordinates, followed by a single word, sanctuary. Outside, as darkness fell, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor sensed she was at a crossroads, similar to the one the MacAllisters had faced. But her path remained unclear. Knowledge was power, but it also brought responsibility she hadn't anticipated when she'd purchased this cursed cabin for a song. The MacAllister journal changed everything. Eleanor sat on her porch until dawn, weighing her options against what she now knew. If the creatures, she struggled to think of them as forest people, had peacefully coexisted with the previous owners, perhaps conflict wasn't inevitable. Sarah leaves food at the forest edge, she read again from her notes. A simple gesture of goodwill that apparently yielded results. After sunrise, Eleanor drove to Pine Ridge for supply. At the general store, she filled her basket with items, not for herself, but for an offering: fresh fruit, jerky, nuts, and honey foods that required no preparation and would appeal to both human and animal sensibilities. Jake raised an eyebrow at her selections. Having a picnic, something like that. Eleanor added a salt lick used by hunters to attract deer. Any unusual visitors to town lately? Like who? Men asking questions, government types interested in wildlife. Jake's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Can't say there have been. Why? Eleanor shrugged. Just curious about local history. The MacAllisters mentioned some researchers before they left. That was 30 years ago. Jake's tone suggested the conversation was over. Back at the cabin, Eleanor carefully arranged her offerings on a flat rock at the forest edge, about 50 yards from her property line. Far enough to be non-threatening, close enough to observe from her porch with binoculars. Before retreating, she positioned 2 new trail cameras, these more carefully camouflaged than her previous attempts. One she placed obviously in a nearby tree. The other, hidden in a hollow log, with just the lens visible, covered the same area from a different angle. A test of intelligence, she murmured. That evening, Eleanor kept her distance, watching through binoculars as darkness slowly enveloped the offering site. Hours passed with no movement. She began to wonder if her gesture had been too late, if trust had been irreparably damaged by her security measures and warning shot. Just after midnight, her alarm system of tin cans rattled on the far side of the clearing, away from the offering site. A diversion. Eleanor remained focused on her binoculars, scanning the forest edge. There, a shadow detaching from deeper shadows. The figure moved with surprising grace, for its size, approaching the offering site cautiously. It paused, noticing the visible camera, then circled wide around the rock. Eleanor smiled. The creature wasn't falling for obvious surveillance. But would it spot the hidden camera? The figure approached from behind the rock, staying low, movements deliberate. In the moonlight, Eleanor could make out broad shoulders, the distinctive profile of a sloped forehead, and shaggy hair covering its body. It examined the offerings without touching them, sniffing cautiously. Finally, it took the salt lick first, a logical choice for a forest dweller. The jerky followed, then the honey, which it scooped with long fingers directly into its mouth. The fruit and nuts were collected rather than eaten, tucked into what appeared to be a crude pouch made from woven plant fibers. Just before retreating, the figure paused. It looked directly toward Eleanor's position on the porch, though she was certain she couldn't be seen in the darkness. Then deliberately it reached into its pouch and placed something on the rock before disappearing into the forest with remarkable speed and silence. Eleanor waited until dawn before approaching the site. The offerings were gone, as expected. In their place sat a small wooden figure, roughly carved but unmistakably meant to represent a human form. A female form, with long hair similar to Eleanor's. She turned it over in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship achieved without modern tools. The face was crude but conveyed a distinct expression, not threatening, but watchful. A message as clear as the go scratched in mud days earlier, but with a very different meaning. The hidden camera had captured everything. Eleanor reviewed the footage, focusing on close-ups of the creature. Male, she guessed from the broad shoulders and size. Approximately 8 feet tall. The face, partially visible in several frames, showed a pronounced brow ridge, wide nose and surprisingly expressive eyes. Not human, but undeniably intelligent, tool-using, capable of symbolic communication. Eleanor placed the carved figure on her workbench, beside the plaster footprint cast, physical evidence of her extraordinary neighbor, and perhaps the beginning of a very unorthodox dialogue. Rain fell steadily for 3 days, swelling the creek to a rushing torrent and turning the ground to mud. Eleanor used the forced confinement to continue cabin repairs, sealing gaps in the walls and reinforcing the new roof sections. The wooden figure kept her company from its place on the workbench, its crude features somehow watching her progress. Each evening she left offerings at the forest edge. Each morning she found them taken, sometimes replaced with objects, unusual stones, a bouquet of pine needles tied with grass, once a perfectly preserved butterfly in a cradle of moss. Eleanor documented everything, building a record of communication. On the 4th day, the storm intensified. Wind howled through the pines, bringing down branches and deadfall. Eleanor secured loose equipment and retreated inside, listening to rain pound against the roof. Her repairs held the interior remaining dry despite the deluge. Shortly after midnight, a tremendous crash jolted her awake. Eleanor grabbed her flashlight and shotgun, moving cautiously to the front room. Through the window, lightning revealed her truck, its hood dented with massive impacts that had crumpled the metal inward. The warning systems hadn't triggered. Whatever caused the damage had approached from beyond their perimeter. Eleanor waited until dawn, when the storm finally broke. Outside, puddles reflected the clearing sky as she surveyed the damage. Deep dents marred the truck's hood, as if struck repeatedly by something with enormous strength. The driver's side mirror had been wrenched off completely. This was different from previous encounters, not curious investigation, but deliberate destruction. Eleanor circled the property, checking her boundary markers, simple cairns of stacked stones she'd placed to define her territory. Several had been toppled, the stones scattered. Others had been moved, repositioned closer to the cabin, effectively shrinking her claim. Pushing back, she murmured. The creek had overflowed its banks during the night, carving new channels through the softer ground. One such channel had redirected water dangerously close to her east side foundation. If left unchecked, the next storm could undermine the cabin's structural integrity. Eleanor spent the morning digging drainage trenches to redirect the flow, her boots sinking ankle-deep in mud. The work was exhausting, but necessary. By midday, sweat-soaked and filthy, she'd created a functional system to protect the foundation. She was retrieving her shovel when something caught her eye, a line of fresh footprints approaching from the forest. Not circling or investigating this time, but moving bare purpose directly toward her drainage work. The prints stopped abruptly at the edge of her new trenches, then turned to follow the rerouted water flow to where it rejoined the creek downstream. Eleanor followed them, concern mounting as she realized the implications. The creature had been watching her work, assessing it, understanding its purpose. At the point where her trenches redirected water back to the creek, Eleanor found her answer. The boundary cairn she'd placed there, marking the southeast corner of her property, had been rebuilt, larger, more deliberate, with new stones arranged in a pattern she recognized from the MacAllister child's drawing. This wasn't random destruction. The creature was challenging her water management, asserting control over the creek's flow. The damaged truck moved boundaries, and now this reconstruction of her markers formed a pattern of escalating territorial responses. Eleanor returned to the cabin, mind racing. The peaceful offerings had established contact, but clearly hadn't resolved the fundamental conflict. They both claimed this land as home. The MacAllisters had built a relationship, but they'd had children, perhaps creating a familial connection. The creatures recognized. Eleanor was alone, an intruder. The wooden carving suggested recognition, but not acceptance. She retrieved the carving, studying its simple features. After a moment's hesitation, she placed it at the center of her security plan diagram, weighing it down with a stone from one of the dismantled boundary cairns. "I understand," she said aloud. "This is about territory." Eleanor spent the afternoon rebuilding her boundary markers, placing them exactly where they'd been originally, not yielding ground, but not claiming more either. At each cairn she left a small offering, berries, nuts, or jerky. As darkness fell, she parked her damaged truck directly in front of the cabin, headlights aimed at the forest edge, keys in the ignition. A strategic retreat remained possible, but something told Eleanor the next encounter would determine whether coexistence was possible, or if one of them would be forced to leave. Eleanor drove her dented truck into Pine Ridge, the front end making an ominous rattling with each pothole. At the general store, Jake let out a low whistle as she parked. "Looks like you hit something, or something hit you. Tree came down in the storm." Eleanor lied. "Need to find someone who can look at it, make sure it's still roadworthy." Jake scratched his beard. "Mike's garage on the east end of town." He hesitated. "How are things out at the cabin?" "Interesting." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "I was hoping to talk to someone who might understand the area better. Someone with historical perspective." "Historical perspective," Jake repeated carefully. "I found some MacAllister family journals. Mentioned beings in the forest. Intelligent ones." Jake's face hardened. "That's just local folklore. Mountain isolation plays tricks on people's minds." "Maybe." Eleanor kept her voice neutral. "But I'd still like to speak with someone who knows the old stories. Maybe from the native communities in the region." Jake's tension was palpable, but after a moment, he scribbled on a scrap of paper. "Margaret Blackfeather. Lives on the reservation 20 miles north. If she's willing to talk to you, she knows more about these mountains than anyone."
"Thank you."
"Eleanor," Jake's voice stopped her at the door. "Be careful with these stories. Some things are best left alone." The reservation's cultural center was a modern building with traditional elements. A circular entryway, decorated with intricate wood carvings. The receptionist directed Eleanor to a small office where an elderly woman sat sorting dried plants into cloth bundles. "Margaret Blackfeather?" Eleanor asked. The woman looked up, sharp eyes assessing Eleanor with unexpected intensity. "You're the one who bought the MacAllister place?" Eleanor blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" "Jake called, said you'd be coming." Margaret gestured to a chair. "He's worried you'll stir up old troubles. I'm more interested in understanding what I'm dealing with." Eleanor placed the wooden carving on the desk between them. Margaret's expression shifted subtly. She lifted the carving, turning it carefully in gnarled fingers. "When did you receive this?" "5 days ago. After I left food offerings at the forest edge. And you've seen the one who made it?" "Yes." Eleanor described her encounters, the territorial dispute, the moved boundary stones. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally nodding. When Eleanor finished, the older woman opened a drawer and removed a small leather pouch decorated with beadwork. "My people have lived in these mountains for countless generations. We have always known about the forest guardian." She untied the pouch, revealing dried herbs, small stones, and what appeared to be tufts of reddish-brown hair, identical to those Eleanor had found. "Forest guardians. You would call them Sasquatch or Bigfoot. We call them Sitco, the ones who run. They've guarded sacred places since before humans walked here. Intelligent, ancient beings who avoid contact with most people. Then why interact with me? or the MacAllisters before. Margaret's smile revealed deep creases around her eyes. They are curious about those who respect the land. The MacAllisters showed kindness to them. And you, she studied Eleanor, you have rebuilt with care, not destruction. You've made offerings. You understand boundaries, but they damaged my truck, moved my markers, testing you, seeing if you would respond with violence. Margaret returned the carving. The shape is significant. It represents recognition. They've marked you, not as prey, but as someone to watch. What do they want? What all beings want? Safety, territory, respect. She reached into another drawer, withdrawing a small medicine pouch on a leather cord. This contains protective herbs and stones from our sacred mountain. It will mark you as someone who understands the old ways. Eleanor accepted the pouch, its weight surprisingly reassuring. How do I communicate with them? Show I'm not a threat. They understand symbols better than words. Create a circle of stones large enough to sit within. Place offerings at the 4 directions, north, south, east, west. Sit in silence as night falls. Do not bring weapons. Do not show fear, and if they approach, do not stare directly. It is considered challenging. Keep your hands visible. Bow your head slightly, a sign of respect, not submission. Margaret's expression grew serious. They are not animals to be tamed, but neither are they monsters. They are guardians of an older world that exists alongside ours. As Eleanor prepared to leave, Margaret added, "Be warned. Others have sought these beings, government men with tranquilizer guns and cages. The forest guardians remember these enemies. If they sense you might betray them, they will vanish, or worse. I just want to understand. Understanding is good." Margaret placed a gnarled hand on Eleanor's arm. "But these beings have survived by remaining hidden. Consider carefully why you seek contact, and what you'll do with what you learn." Eleanor drove back toward her cabin, the medicine pouch hanging from the rearview mirror, swaying with each bump in the road. For the first time since discovering the footprint, she felt a path forward, not through confrontation, but through the ancient language of ritual and respect. Eleanor gathered smooth river stones throughout the afternoon, selecting 16 of similar size. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, she cleared a patch of ground near the boundary between her property and the forest, neutral territory. Following Margaret's instructions, she created a perfect circle, large enough to sit comfortably within. At the 4 cardinal points, she placed her offerings: honey to the north, jerky to the east, fresh berries to the south, and nuts to the west. Around her neck hung Margaret's medicine pouch, its unfamiliar weight both comforting and strange. Eleanor removed her boots before entering the circle, feeling the cool earth against her bare feet, another of Margaret's suggestions to connect with the land. She sat cross-legged at the center, facing east toward the rising moon, and waited. Twilight deepened into darkness. Nocturnal sounds emerged: the hoot of an owl, rustling underbrush, the distant howl of a coyote. Eleanor breathed deeply, fighting the instinct to return to the cabin's safety as true night enveloped her. The first hour passed slowly, then another, muscles cramped from stillness, but Eleanor remained, focusing on steady breathing. Margaret had been clear patience was essential. The forest guardians would approach in their own time, if at all. Near midnight, the forest fell suddenly, unnaturally silent. Even the insects ceased their chorus. Eleanor kept her gaze lowered, heart pounding, every sense strained. Movement registered in her peripheral vision, something large approaching from the north. She resisted the urge to turn her head, instead keeping her hands open on her knees, posture relaxed, despite her racing pulse. The figure circled her stone arrangement, keeping to the shadows. Eleanor caught glimpses of its massive form, broader and taller than any human, moving with deliberate caution. It stopped at each cardinal point, inspecting the offerings without taking them. Finally, it approached the circle's edge, close enough that Eleanor could hear its breathing. Deep, rhythmic sounds, unlike any animal she knew. The forest guardian stood motionless, observing her. Following Margaret's guidance, Eleanor bowed her head slightly, then raised her open palms in greeting. After a moment's hesitation, she spoke softly. "I come with respect." The creature made a low, rumbling sound, not threatening, but clearly responsive. It moved closer, now fully visible in the moonlight. Standing upright, it towered over Eleanor's seated form, easily 8 feet tall. Powerful shoulders and chest gave way to slightly shorter legs, all covered in thick reddish-brown hair. Its face, partially shadowed, showed a pronounced brow ridge, deep-set eyes that reflected the moonlight, and a surprisingly expressive mouth. Eleanor remained still as the being crouched at the circle's edge, bringing its face level with hers, its eyes, dark, intelligent, unmistakably cognizant, studied her with evident curiosity. Slowly, Eleanor reached for the wooden carving in her pocket, holding it up for the creature to see. Its response was immediate, a huffing sound, and a slight nodding motion that seemed almost like recognition. The guardian reached toward the eastern offering, taking a piece of jerky with surprisingly dexterous fingers. It consumed the food while maintaining eye contact, then selected items from each cardinal point, eating some and placing others in the woven pouch at its waist. After completing this circuit, it retreated several paces, then bent to the ground. Eleanor watched as the creature arranged a collection of small stones on the earth, forming what appeared to be a pattern. The guardian straightened, made another rumbling sound, then melted back into the forest darkness with astonishing silence for its size. Eleanor waited until dawn, ensuring the encounter was truly complete, before rising stiffly from her position. The offerings were gone, but the stone arrangement remained. Studying it in the morning light, Eleanor realized it wasn't random. The guardian had created a crude but recognizable map of the property, with larger stones marking the cabin, creek, and what appeared to be cave systems in the nearby mountains that Eleanor hadn't yet explored. One area was circled with smaller pebbles, a location about a mile northeast of her cabin. A message, Eleanor realized, an invitation. She photographed the stone map before carefully gathering each piece, placing them in a pouch similar to the one the guardian had carried. This communication, primitive but unmistakable, represented more than territorial negotiation. It was the beginning of understanding. As she walked back to the cabin, Eleanor found herself smiling. In her mind, she had begun to think of the forest guardian by a name, Mac, after the family whose journal had led her to this moment. The crunch of tires on gravel jerked Eleanor from sleep. She reached for her shotgun before registering the sound. A vehicle approaching. Visitors were rare enough to be concerning, especially unannounced. Through the window she recognized Jake's truck, but he wasn't alone. 3 men in outdoor gear accompanied him, carrying backpacks and what looked suspiciously like specialized equipment cases. Eleanor tucked the wooden carving and stone map into a drawer before stepping onto the porch, keeping her expression neutral. Jake, unexpected surprise. "Morning, Eleanor." Jake seemed uncomfortable, avoiding her eyes. "These fellas are hiking buddies of mine. Thought we'd check how you're doing after that big storm." The men nodded politely. One stepped forward, extending his hand. "Evan Mercer, we've been exploring these mountains for years. Jake mentioned you've had some interesting wildlife encounters." Eleanor shook his hand briefly, noting the firm grip and the calculating assessment in his eyes. "Nothing unusual, just the standard forest residents. Mind if we look around? These old homesteads have fascinating history." Before Eleanor could object, the men had spread out, examining the property with too much purpose for casual visitors. One photographed her repaired drainage system. Another studied the tree line with binoculars. The third, Evan, lingered near Eleanor, maintaining conversation while his eyes continuously scanned the clearing. "Jake mentioned you've been leaving food out, attracting wildlife." "Just getting to know my neighbors," Eleanor replied carefully. "Any large predators? Bears, mountain lion?" "Nothing concerning." Evan's radio crackled. One of his companions spoke in abbreviated code. Sierra 3 negative on primary target area. Eleanor's suspicions crystallized. These weren't hikers. This was a search team, and Jake had led them here. Found something, called the man near the forest edge. He waved them over to a tree where one of Eleanor's camouflage trail cameras was mounted. Interesting placement, Evan commented. What are you monitoring? General wildlife patterns, Eleanor said, watching Jake's guilty expression. Jake, could I speak with you privately? She led him toward the cabin, keeping her voice low. Who are these men? Really? Jake sighed. Researchers. They've been tracking unusual wildlife sightings in these mountains for years. Government researchers, Eleanor pressed, remembering the MacAllister Journal. Independent team. Legitimate scientists. Jake wouldn't meet her eyes. Look, they approached me after you started asking questions. They've offered good money for information. Information about what I've seen. About the creatures. Jake finally looked at her. They know, Eleanor. They've been monitoring this area long before you arrived. Cold realization washed over her. They've had cameras on my property. Jake nodded. They're interested in documentation, not harm. Scientific discovery. A shout from Evan interrupted them. He stood at the forest edge, examining a fresh footprint, one of Mac's, with unmistakable excitement. Incredible specimen. 14, maybe 15 inches. Harold, get the casting material. Eleanor felt sick as the men crowded around the print, discussing it with scientific detachment that couldn't mask their enthusiasm for the discovery. Evan approached, no longer bothering with the hiking pretense. Ms. Reed, we're tracking a potentially undocumented bipedal species. Based on evidence, we believe you've had direct contact. We'd like to set up monitoring equipment around your property. No. Eleanor's response was immediate. This is private property. We can compensate you generously. Evan reached for his wallet. And we have permits for scientific research in this county. Not on my land, you don't. Evan's pleasant mask slipped. Ms. Reed, this could be the zoozoological discovery of the century. You could be part of legitimate scientific history. Eleanor thought of Mac's intelligent eyes, the careful stone arrangement, the wooden carving. These mountains have been here for millennia. Whatever lives here isn't yours to discover. They're not people, Ms. Reed. They're unclassified primates. A subtle movement at the forest edge caught Eleanor's attention. A shadow darker than the surrounding vegetation. Mac was watching, had perhaps been watching the entire time. Eleanor made a split-second decision. She knocked over a stack of firewood with a tremendous crash, shouting, "Bear, look out!" The researchers scrambled, reaching for weapons. In the confusion, Eleanor glimpsed Mac's retreating form disappearing deeper into the trees. Safe, for now. Evan recovered quickly, scanning the tree line. There's no bear, my mistake. Eleanor crossed her arms, but you need to leave, now. Later, as Jake's truck disappeared down the access road, Eleanor knew two things with certainty. She'd made an enemy of Evan Mercer, and Jake's betrayal had fundamentally changed her situation. The researchers would return, and next time they'd come prepared to find what they sought regardless of her objections. Eleanor spent the afternoon removing the researchers' hidden cameras from her property. She found 6 in total, some obviously recent, others weathered enough to have been there for months, perhaps even before she purchased the cabin. As dusk approached, headlights appeared on the access road, Jake's truck again. But this time he was alone. Eleanor waited on the porch, shotgun visible but not aimed. Jake parked at a respectful distance and approached with hands slightly raised. "I deserved that welcome," he said, nodding toward the weapon. "Why are you back?" "To explain." Jake looked genuinely remorseful. "You deserved better than what happened today." Eleanor gestured to a chair, keeping the shotgun across her knees. "Start talking." Jake sank heavily into the seat. "Those men aren't just researchers. They're part of a private contractor group, working with a government program. They've been studying the creatures in these mountains for decades. Since before the MacAllisters disappeared." He nodded. The program was called NACACP, Non-Human Intelligent Species Containment Program. Started as a fringe military research project in the 70s, became something bigger when they actually found evidence. Evidence of the forest guardians, they call them specimens, have documented at least 8 different individuals in this region alone. Jake pulled a folded paper from his jacket, an official-looking ID with government seals, and Evan Mercer's photograph. Evan dropped this during the confusion. Thought you should see who you're dealing with. Eleanor examined the badge. Department of Interior, Biological Research Division. The classification level and other details were partially redacted. They approached me 15 years ago, after I reported unusual tracks near my hunting cabin. Offered money for information, convinced me it was for scientific advancement. Jake looked away. By the time I realized their methods weren't purely scientific, I was already involved. What methods? They've captured 3 specimens that I know of. Tranquilizer guns, specialized containment units. The creatures were transported to facilities for study. Jake's voice dropped. None were ever released. Eleanor felt sick. And the MacAllisters? John MacAllister discovered the truth. He was a Forestry Service employee with access to restricted areas, found documents he wasn't supposed to see. Jake rubbed his... When he threatened to go golly, they gave him a choice. Relocate under a new identity or face charges of interfering with national security. They forced them to leave. Officially, the family entered witness protection. New names, new location. Jake hesitated, but there were rumors they escaped during transport, with help from the forest guardians they'd befriended. No one's seen them since. Eleanor thought of the journal's final entry and the cryptic coordinates. Sanctuary, she murmured. What? Nothing. She studied Jake. Why tell me this now? Because they'll be back. With more people, better equipment, and authorization. He leaned forward. The MacAllister property wasn't sold at auction by accident. Eleanor, it was deliberately made available at an irresistible price to attract someone like you. Why? Former park ranger. Outdoor experience. Independent. Someone who might encounter the creatures and document them without the resources to hide what they found. Jake's expression was grim. You were The pieces clicked into place. The suspiciously low price, the realtor's eagerness to close quickly, the ready availability of a property most would avoid. What does Evan want from me now? Partnership, access to your land, your observations. Jake stood, pacing the small porch. If you refuse, they'll find ways to pressure you, cite code violations on the cabin, question your property rights, maybe even suggest you're mentally unstable after too much isolation. And if I agree, you'll get funding recognition in any published findings. Jake's voice turned bitter. And you'll help them capture intelligent beings who've harmed no one. Eleanor set aside the shotgun, mind racing through options. How much time do I have? They're regrouping, bringing specialized equipment. 3 days. Maybe 4. Jake headed toward his truck, then turned back. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I was wrong about these creatures and about you. As his taillights disappeared down the mountain road, Eleanor had retrieved the MacAllister journal and the brass key. The cryptic coordinates suddenly held new urgency. If Sanctuary was what she suspected, a refuge created by the MacAllisters, it might be Mac's only hope, and hers. Moonlight filtered through the pines as Eleanor moved silently through the forest. The night vision goggles, expensive equipment from her ranger days that she'd thankfully kept, transformed the darkness into an eerie green landscape of shadows and silhouettes. She followed the coordinates from the MacAllister journal, climbing steadily higher into the mountains. The location indicated a point approximately 2 miles northeast of her cabin, in terrain she hadn't yet explored. Eleanor had spent the day in careful preparation. She'd appeared to cooperate when Evan called, agreeing to meet his team the following afternoon to discuss terms. The conversation bought her precious time, a single night to act. The trail grew steeper, rougher. Eleanor checked her GPS again. Close now. She paused, listening intently. Nothing but ordinary forest sounds. "Mac," she called softly. "I need to talk to you." Silence answered. Eleanor moved forward cautiously until she reached a small clearing. According to her coordinates, this was the location, but nothing about it appeared special. No cabin, no structure, nothing to indicate a sanctuary. Disappointment settled heavily. She'd risked everything on this nighttime expedition, hoping to warn Mac of the impending threat. A subtle shift in air pressure was her only warning before a massive form emerged from the shadows behind her. Eleanor froze, then slowly raised her empty hand. "I come with warning," she said quietly, not turning around. "The men who came today, they hunt your kind." A low huffing sound acknowledged her words. Mac moved into her peripheral vision, then gestured with surprising clarity for her to follow. He led her to a rock face that appeared solid until Mac pressed against a specific section. A narrow opening appeared, a natural crevice cleverly concealed. Inside, the passage widened into a cave system. Mac moved confidently through the darkness, occasionally looking back to ensure Eleanor followed. The tunnels sloped downward, then up again, emerging finally into a massive cavern. Eleanor gasped. The space was illuminated by shafts of moonlight from natural openings high above, and it wasn't empty. At least a dozen forest guardians occupied the cavern. Some smaller females, Eleanor guessed. Others clearly juveniles, their movements more energetic. They froze at her appearance, several moving protectively toward the younger ones. Mac made a series of vocalizations, complex sounds combining deep rumbles with higher chirps. The tension in the cavern eased slightly, though watchful eyes remained fixed on Eleanor. One of the smaller guardians approached, studying Eleanor intently before reaching toward the medicine pouch at her neck. Eleanor remained still as the female touched it, then made a sound of apparent recognition. "Margaret," Eleanor said, understanding dawning. "You know Margaret Blackfeather." The female guardian made an affirmative sound, then extended something toward Eleanor, a tattered fabric patch bearing the insignia of the Forestry Service. The same service John MacAllister had worked for. "You knew the MacAllisters," Eleanor breathed. "They helped you hide." Mac led Eleanor deeper into the cavern, where evidence of a long-established community became clear. Crude but effective tools lined rock shelves, woven containers held gathered foods. One area contained what appeared to be healing herbs, arranged with deliberate care. Most remarkable was a wall covered with symbolic drawings, images of forest guardians, humans, and what Eleanor recognized as warning depictions of men with guns and cages. This wasn't merely a hiding place, it was a culture. A society with history, communication, and collective memory. Mac indicated a drawing of what appeared to be the MacAllister family standing beside guardians. Then he touched a freshly drawn image that Eleanor recognized with a shock, herself identifiable by her turned hair, standing at the stone circle from their ritual communication. The meaning was clear: the MacAllisters had been allies. Now Mac was asking if she would be one too. Eleanor removed her night vision goggles, meeting Mac's eyes directly. "Men are coming. Many men, with weapons that will make you sleep. They want to take you away for study." She pointed to the drawings of cages. "They'll be at my cabin tomorrow." Mac's understanding was evident. He conferred with the others through vocalizations Eleanor couldn't comprehend but recognized as complex communication. The female approached again, offering Eleanor berries from a woven container. Eleanor understood the gesture's significance: breaking bread, sharing food, an ancient symbol of trust. She accepted the berries, then unfolded the property map she'd brought. "My land, your territory." Eleanor circled the cabin. "Men come here tomorrow." She pointed to the caves. This sanctuary must be protected. Max studied the map, then made a decisive series of markings, routes through the forest, alternative cave entrances, potential escape paths. His spatial awareness and strategic thinking were unmistakable. As dawn approached, Eleanor prepared to leave. The alliance had been formed, but one critical question remained: how to protect these intelligent beings from modern humans, determined to capture them for study and exploitation. The answer, Eleanor realized as she descended toward her cabin, might lie not in running or hiding, but in changing the terms of engagement completely. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she dialed Margaret Blackfeather's number. The elder answered on the third ring. "I've met them," Eleanor said without preamble. "The forest guardians, and they're in danger." Silence stretched for several seconds before Margaret responded. "You've been to the sanctuary?" "Yes, there are at least a dozen, including young ones." Eleanor explained about Evan's team, their government connections, and their plans to capture the creatures. "This has happened before," Margaret said heavily. "The Guardians retreat deeper into the mountains, but their territory shrinks with each passing year." "I don't want them to run this time," Eleanor replied. "I want to protect them legally, make it impossible for anyone to study them without consent." "How?" "I need your help, Ed, and your tribes. Is there any way to designate land as protected due to cultural significance?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Yes, if we can demonstrate sacred or historical importance to tribal heritage, we can petition for protected status." Her voice grew cautious. "But it requires documentation, tribal council approval, and usually years of legal process." "We don't have years, we have hours." Eleanor glanced at her property deed, an idea forming. "What if I signed my land over to tribal protection as a heritage preserve? That would require tribal council approval and evidence. I have the MacAllister journals, documented encounters going back generations. Your people's stories, possibly enough for emergency temporary protection," Margaret conceded. "I can call the council for an emergency meeting, please, as soon as possible." Eleanor spent the morning meticulously documenting everything: the footprint casts, the wooden carving, the stone map, and most importantly, the MacAllister journal entries. She organized them chronologically, building a compelling case for the creature's intelligence and historical presence. At noon, her satellite phone rang. Margaret's voice was tense but determined. "The council has agreed to meet at 4 o'clock. They're skeptical but willing to listen." "I'll be there." "And Margaret, thank you." The tribal council chambers were imposing. A circular room with high windows and walls adorned with traditional art. 7 elders seated at a long table regarded Eleanor with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. Margaret made the introductions, then moved to stand beside Eleanor in a show of support. For the next hour, Eleanor presented her evidence methodically, the journal entries documenting the MacAllisters' interactions, the physical artifacts, her own encounters, including Mac's obvious intelligence and communication abilities. "The forest guardians have lived in these mountains since time immemorial," she concluded. "They aren't animals to be captured and studied. They're an ancient, intelligent species, deserving of protection." The head councilman, a stern-faced elder named Joseph Running Bear, studied Eleanor carefully. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Reed?" Eleanor unfolded her property deed. "I want to establish my land as a protected heritage site under tribal guardianship, a sanctuary where these beings can't be hunted or captured." "You would give up your property rights?" Joseph asked, clearly skeptical. "I would transfer them to tribal protection, yes, with the condition that I remain as caretaker and liaison." The council deliberated in hushed tones while Eleanor waited, acutely aware of time slipping away. Evan's team would arrive tomorrow, expecting to find a compliant landowner and accessible creatures to study. Finally, Joseph addressed Eleanor directly. "Your evidence is compelling if unconventional. The council is willing to accept provisional guardianship of the land, pending formal documentation and legal process." Relief flooded through Eleanor. How quickly can we make this official? Our tribal attorney can draft emergency protective documents by morning. It won't be perfect legal protection, but it creates significant obstacles for anyone seeking to conduct operations on the land. That's exactly what we need. Obstacles, Eleanor said. Enough to make them reconsider. As they left the council chambers, Margaret squeezed Eleanor's arm. This is only the beginning. The government has powerful tools to override tribal claims when motivated. Then we need insurance. Eleanor pulled out her phone. Something that would make it too costly for them to proceed. Back at the cabin, Eleanor worked into the night, preparing for Evan's arrival. She compiled selected photographs and video clips onto a memory card, carefully documenting the creatures while protecting the sanctuary's location. Enough evidence to prove their existence, not enough to lead to their capture. Just before dawn, she drove into Pine Ridge and mailed identical packages to 3 destinations: a prominent environmental journalist, a civil rights attorney specializing in indigenous cases, and Bill Cooper, the retired forest ranger. Each contained copies of her documentation and a letter explaining the situation, to be opened if they didn't hear from her within 48 hours. As sunlight crested the mountains, Eleanor stood on her porch, watching the access road. Her property deed, now bearing provisional tribal protection documents, sat on the table beside her. The trap was set, not for the forest guardians, but for those who would hunt them. Evan's convoy would arrive expecting to find creatures to capture. Instead, they would find legal complications, public exposure threats, and a woman determined to protect her unusual neighbors, no matter the cost. The convoy appeared precisely at noon, 3 black SUVs and a large equipment truck, kicking up dust as they navigated the access road. Eleanor counted at least 8 people through her binoculars, including Evan Mercer and 2 men in official-looking uniforms. She waited on the porch, outwardly calm despite her racing heart. The lead vehicle stopped, and Evan emerged, surveying the property with the confidence of someone who already considered it under his control. "Miss Reed," he called, approaching with an extended hand, "I appreciate your willingness to cooperate." Eleanor didn't take his hand. "I agreed to meet, that's all." Evan's smile tightened. "Of course. Perhaps we could discuss terms inside. We can talk here." Eleanor gestured to the porch chairs. "Your team can wait by their vehicles." Evan signaled to the others, who remained in position but began unloading equipment, camera gear, tracking devices, and several large metal cages that confirmed Eleanor's worst fears. "Let me be direct," Evan began once seated. "We know you've had significant contact with the specimens we're studying. Your documentation would be invaluable to our research. And what exactly does your research involve?" "Observation. Limited specimen collection for biological sampling. Perhaps temporary relocation of one individual for comprehensive study." "Capture and imprisonment, you mean?" Eleanor's voice remained level. "These beings are intelligent, communal, and have historical significance to this region." Evan's expression hardened. "They're unclassified primates, Miss Reed. Scientifically important, certainly, but not people. The local tribal council disagrees." Eleanor slid the property documents toward him. "As of this morning, this land is designated as a protected tribal heritage site due to its cultural significance." Evan scanned the papers, his confidence visibly faltering. "This is a delaying tactic at best. We have federal authorization, which now requires tribal consultation and approval." Eleanor leaned forward. "And while you're navigating that legal labyrinth, these might become public." She placed a memory card on the table between them. "What's this?" "Insurance. I've documented everything, the creatures, their social structure, their intelligence. Copies have been sent to journalists, attorneys, and wildlife protection organizations to be released if anything happens to me or if unauthorized operations occur on this land." One of Evan's team approached, urgency in his stride. "Sir, we've got a problem. Road's been blocked below. Tribal police, and what looks like a council delegation." Through her binoculars, Eleanor confirmed Margaret had delivered on her promise. A roadblock had been established at the property boundary, staffed by tribal authorities. Evan's calm facade cracked. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. This research has national security implications. Because these creatures are intelligent," Eleanor pressed, "because acknowledging their existence would force us to reconsider our place in the natural world. Because understanding their biological makeup could revolutionize medicine, military applications, communications technology." Evan gestured toward the forest. "They're scientific gold mines, and you're treating them like endangered butterflies." The radio at Evan's belt crackled to life. "Sir, movement detected on the eastern perimeter. Multiple large heat signatures." Eleanor's breath caught. Despite her warnings, Mac and the others were nearby, watching, perhaps even preparing to defend their territory. Evan snatched up the radio. "Prepare tranquilizer protocols. Teams 2 and 3. Converge on the eastern sector." "I wouldn't." Eleanor nodded toward the memory card. "One call from me, and everything goes public. Your program, your methods, these beings' existence." The media circus would make further covert research impossible. The standoff stretched for 10 seconds before Evan spoke into the radio again. "Stand down. Maintain positions." He turned back to Eleanor. "What exactly do you want? A formal agreement? No captures, no invasive study without consent, protocols developed with tribal oversight." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "These beings have a right to exist undisturbed. That's not how science works. It's how ethical science works." She nodded toward where the tribal delegation was now approaching on foot. Margaret Blackfeather in the lead. "And you're outvoted." For the next hour, an extraordinary negotiation unfolded on Eleanor's porch. The tribal council representatives, led by Joseph Running Bear, presented their legal claim to protect the land based on ancestral connections to the forest guardian. Evan's team argued for scientific access, their position weakening as Eleanor's documentation and the tribal claims created a legal morass. As sunset approached, Evan made a final appeal. "Just one specimen. Temporary study with full tribal observation." "No specimens," Eleanor replied firmly, feeling Mac's unseen presence in the nearby forest. "These are beings, not samples." In the gathering darkness, something shifted in the forest edge, a deliberate movement that caught everyone's attention. For a brief moment, Mac stood visible at the tree line, his massive silhouette unmistakable against the darkening sky. The sight silenced all argument. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, Mac vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a message as clear as any human declaration. "I am here. I am watching. I am not yours to take." Evan stared at the empty forest edge, the reality of what he faced finally sinking in. "This isn't over," he said quietly, but his tone lacked conviction. Eleanor smiled. "No, it's just beginning." 6 months transformed the MacAllister cabin. Spring blossoms gave way to summer greenery as Eleanor completed the restoration, turning the once dilapidated structure into a comfortable home. The roof no longer leaked. The walls stood straight and solid. Large windows faced the forest, offering expansive views of the mountains beyond. Yet the most significant changes remained invisible to casual observers. A formal conservation easement now protected the property and surrounding forest, co-managed by Eleanor and the tribal council. The legal document, displayed prominently on her living room wall, established the land as a protected habitat for indigenous wildlife and culturally significant species. The government research team hadn't disappeared entirely. After weeks of negotiation, a compromise emerged. Limited, non-invasive observation under strict tribal oversight. No captures, no tracking devices, no habitat disruption. Evan had fought the restrictions bitterly, but faced with the alternatives, public exposure or complete exclusion, he'd eventually conceded. His team now operated from a small research station at the property's edge, their activities carefully monitored. Eleanor sipped her morning coffee on the porch, watching researchers set up camera equipment at their designated observation point, far enough from the forest edge to respect boundaries, close enough to document the occasional glimpses Mac allowed them. Margaret Blackfeather's truck appeared on the access road, right on schedule. The elder had become a regular visitor, her traditional knowledge guiding the delicate balance between scientific observation and cultural respect. "The council is pleased," Margaret announced as she settled into a porch chair. The guardians seemed comfortable with the arrangement. "Mac's people are adapting," Eleanor agreed. "They understand the observers won't cross the boundaries." "Mac," Margaret's eyes crinkled with amusement. "You've named the alpha male after the MacAllisters." It seemed fitting. Eleanor smiled. "They were right to protect them, and they would be proud of what you've accomplished." Margaret gestured toward the research station. "Turning enemies into reluctant allies is no small feat. Allies is generous." They still see the forest guardians as specimens, not beings. Perspectives change slowly, but they're changing. Margaret reached into her bag, removing a folded newspaper. "Have you seen this?" The article featured a grainy but unmistakable photo of Mac standing at the forest edge, captured by one of the research team's cameras. The headline read, "Sasquatch Study Reveals Complex Social Behavior. Reclassification Considered." "They're acknowledging intelligence," Eleanor noted, scanning the text, "and social structures. The first step toward recognition." Margaret tapped the paper. "The council is submitting a formal petition for protected species status under both environmental and cultural heritage laws." As the sun climbed higher, Eleanor walked Margaret to her truck. The research team nodded respectfully as they passed, a courtesy that had taken months to establish. "Will you join us for the summer solstice ceremony?" Margaret asked before departing. "The guardians are welcome too, of course. It's their celebration as much as ours." "I'll be there, Mac's people. We'll see." Alone again, Eleanor followed the now familiar path into the forest. Beyond her property boundary, through dense underbrush few would think passable, lay a small clearing she visited daily. She carried no offerings today. That ritual, while still occasionally observed, had evolved into something more profound, mutual respect rather than appeasement. At the clearing's edge, Eleanor waited patiently. Within minutes, a rustling announced Mac's arrival. He emerged with the confidence of established trust, massive but no longer intimidating. Mac was not alone. The female guardian Eleanor had met at the sanctuary accompanied him, along with a juvenile who watched Eleanor with open curiosity. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Mac indicated the valley below with a sweeping gesture, where the research station's activities continued under careful supervision. Eleanor nodded her understanding. The situation remained acceptable. The female guardian approached, extending something in her enormous hand, a woven bracelet of plant fibers, decorated with small polished stones. Eleanor accepted it with a slight bow, the gesture of friendship unmistakable. As dusk approached, Eleanor returned to her cabin. From her back porch, she could see Mac's silhouette on a distant ridge, watching over his territory as he had for countless seasons before her arrival. In her study, Eleanor opened the leather-bound journal she'd started the day after the confrontation with Evan's team. Its pages documented daily observations, interactions, and the gradually deepening understanding between two intelligent species sharing one ancient forest. Tonight's entry would note the bracelet, the juvenile's curious approach, the peaceful coexistence that seemed almost miraculous, given how differently things might have unfolded. "The MacAllisters understood what I'm only beginning to grasp," she wrote. "These mountains hold secrets worth protecting, beings who were here long before us, who may well remain long after. My role isn't to expose their existence to the world, but to ensure they can continue their lives undisturbed, as they have for generations." Eleanor closed the journal and stepped onto the porch as stars appeared overhead. Somewhere in the darkness, Mac and his family were returning to their sanctuary. Tomorrow, they would emerge again into their ancestral territory, moving more freely than they had in decades. On the opposite ridge, a small campfire marked the research team's position, observers, not hunters. The fragile truce held, day by day. Eleanor smiled. The cabin that had once seemed cursed had become exactly what she'd hoped to find when she'd placed that fateful auction bid. A true sanctuary, not just for herself, but for beings far more remarkable than she could have imagined.